Hello everyone and welcome to the Proteus session on specifying patient-reported outcome methods appropriately. The session will focus on the use of the Spirit PRO extension protocol guidance. My name is Mel Calvert and I'm Professor of Outcomes Methodology and Director of the Centre for Patient-Reported Outcomes Research at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And I'm delighted to be co-chairing this session with my good friend and collaborator, Professor Madeline King.
Hello everyone. I'm Professor Emeritus at the University of Sydney in Australia. I'm a specialist in quality of life research and patient-reported outcomes. Thank you for your interest in the Proteus Consortium. This consortium aims to optimise the use of patient-reported outcomes so that they capture the patient's perspective effectively in both clinical trials and clinical practice. In this presentation, we focus on clinical trials. But before going on, I'd just like to acknowledge funding from the Patient-Centred Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, and Genentech for the Proteus presentations and resources. So in this context, Proteus stands for Patient-Reported Outcome Tools, Engaging Users and Stakeholders. And as you'll see if you go to our website, theproteusconsortium.org, we have a range of resources there for all sorts of users and stakeholders interested in patient-reported outcomes. This presentation is one in a series produced by Proteus that describe and explain the tools and the resources that are available, and they're all designed to optimise the use of patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials. To achieve this optimisation, we need best practices across the continuum of a clinical trial lifecycle, as shown here. So starting with the trial protocol, we need to optimise its content with respect to PROs. We also need to select the appropriate PRO measure or questionnaire, and then we need to conduct statistical analyses that are appropriate for the trial's PRO-specific objectives. Then we need to report and display the trial results clearly and appropriately. And finally, we need to communicate these results for use in clinical practice. So in this presentation, as highlighted here in yellow, we explain how to apply the Spirit PRO guidance. Now, this is consensus-based guidance about what to include about PRO endpoints in clinical trial protocols during their development. And as well as explaining, we also, provide some examples. In other presentations, we provide broad overviews of all the Proteus tools, and we also provide a set of advanced presentations that explain and illustrate how to apply each of the tools individually. Following the Spirit PRO guidance is the first step towards producing high-quality PRO evidence. Clinical trial protocols are the essential documents that describe the study design and conduct. A protocol should provide sufficient detail to enable the funders, reviewers, and ethics committees to appraise the scientific, methodological, and ethical rigour of the trial, and for the research team to conduct a high-quality study. So although trial protocols serve as the foundation for study planning, conduct, reporting, and appraisal, they can vary greatly in content and quality. To address this, the Spirit initiative, and where Spirit stands for Standard Protocol Items, Recommendations for Interventional Trials, the Spirit statement was published in 2013. Spirit provides an evidence-based list of items recommended for inclusion in trial protocols. I've always thought that the mantra, "Get it right in the protocol and all else will follow," was a really good one. But I've discovered through experience that it's not quite right. Things can still go wrong if care is not taken during trial conduct, analysis, and reporting. But still, getting it right in the protocol is a very good start. So why is the Spirit PRO guidance needed? Well, Professor Calvert will go into this in more detail, and I'll just say briefly here that we developed the Spirit PRO guidance to ensure that the critical aspects of the PRO sub-study are included in the full protocol. In turn, That should facilitate successful conduct of the PRO sub-study, which in turn should produce high-quality PRO data. And what does the Spirit Pro guidance do? It recommends the relevant information or items to include in clinical trial protocols that include PROs as either primary or secondary outcomes. The Spirit Pro checklist is an extension of the original Spirit statement published in 2013. The Spirit 2013 statement provided evidence-based list of recommendations for inclusion in trial protocols, as I said earlier. It does not, however, provide specific guidance on protocol content relating to patient-reported outcomes, or PROs, such as health-related quality of life and patient-reported symptoms. So we went through a rigorous process to develop evidence-based PRO-specific protocol guidance. And the paper you see on this slide, published in 2018, describes this rigorous process. And it provides the list of PRO-specific items as they relate to the original Spirit 2013 items. We subsequently wrote a longer paper that includes examples from real-world protocols and longer explanations of why each PRO-specific item is important. I think that'll be a very useful paper for many of you as well. So full citation details of these papers are provided on the last slide of this presentation. We gratefully acknowledge the members of the executive group that led the development of the PRO guidance, and also the members of the wider Spirit Pro project team, who all generously gave their time and expertise, all so essential to the rigorous consensus process that was required for this. We also gratefully acknowledge our collaborators from the International Society of Quality of Life Research Taskforce for best practices for PROs in randomized clinical trials protocol checklist. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it? And also the ISOQOL members that completed the stakeholder survey. We also thank the institutions that supported this endeavour, and some supported it with funding and others supported it with in-kind support. I'll hand over now to Professor Calvert for more on our motivation and process and a discussion of each one of the PRO checklist items. Over to you, Mel.
Thank you, Professor King. So, as Madeleine has highlighted, we really do need to ensure that we have high quality collection of PROs in clinical trials. And what we've found from a number of systematic reviews over recent years is that sadly, the PRO content of clinical trial protocols can be very poor. Many trialists will say that they're using particular questionnaires at certain time points, but may actually provide very little further information within the protocol. And this is a real challenge because if people don't understand why they're collecting PRO data, for example, the research personnel involved, and if subsequently the patients themselves don't understand why the PRO data is being collected in the trial, then this can lead to high levels of missing data or suboptimal data quality. Subsequently, this may lead to suboptimal reporting, and crucially, this can then limit the data that is available for use by regulators in health technology assessment, in clinical practice guidelines, and crucially, for the care of the patients themselves. Personally, I feel it's totally unethical for us to be collecting PRO data in clinical trials if those data aren't subsequently reported to inform the future care of patients. As Madeleine said, there's a fantastic resource, the Spirit 2013 guidelines, which do provide guidance on the design of clinical trial protocols generally. And I'd definitely look at this as a really useful resource when designing your trial protocol. However, as she's also highlighted, this didn't include PRO-specific guidance and hence the real need for the Spirit Pro extension. So the objective of the Spirit Pro extension was to provide international consensus-based pro-specific protocol guidance. As highlighted, we've used rigorous methods for the development of this, involving many international stakeholders. and trying to represent the views of these broad stakeholder groups, including trialists, clinicians, methodologists, patient partners, regulator, those from health technology assessment agencies, journal editors, and funders and industry. So we really did bring together a very broad stakeholder group to ensure that these guidelines really met their needs. Initial work comprised of a systematic review of existing guidelines, which were very disparate and spread across numerous journal articles. Hence why it's probably up to this point was challenging for people to know what exact guidance to follow. We also undertook a protocol checklist taskforce review of the items identified with our collaborators within the International Society for Quality of Life Research Taskforce. We undertook an international stakeholder survey and 2 rounds of an international Delphi survey comprising of the stakeholder groups that I've just mentioned. We held an international consensus meeting with 29 individuals, again broadly representing those stakeholder groups, at which we finalised the Spirit Pro extension. During the process, the Delphi process, we had a number of rounds of voting, as I've said, where individuals indicated the relative importance of items, and we had specified thresholds at which for inclusion, and further details of this can be found in the JAMA paper. So this slide provides an overview of the Spirit Pro protocol guidance, which, as we've said, should be used in conjunction with the Spirit 2013 statement and related extensions. For example, there's been a recent extension for the use in artificial intelligence trials. The Spirit Pro extension, it comprises 5 elaborations of the existing Spirit 2013 checklist items as applied to PROs in RCT protocols. Furthermore, it has 11 new extensions. These are additional pro-specific items recommended for the use in clinical trial protocols where PROs are a primary or important secondary outcome. So let's now talk you through each of these different items. So initially we'll focus on the administrative information and information that can be included in the background and introduction section of your protocol. So the first item, Spirit item 5A, focuses around the roles and responsibilities within the protocol development. So Spirit 2013 stated that the names, affiliations, and the roles of protocol contributors should be stated. In the pro elaboration to this, we've noted that you should specify the individual responsible for the PRO content of the trial protocol. And this is really important because it promotes the transparency and accountability of who has inputted to the PRO strategy within that protocol. And it also identifies an appropriate point of contact for resolution of any pro-specific queries. We also believe that patient partners should be involved right from the very early stages of designing your study. So even in prioritising the research area for research. And if patient partners have actively contributed to the protocol development, which we believe they should, then we believe it's important to acknowledge their contribution and name them if possible as well within the protocol. So the next item, Spirit item 6A, is focused on the background and rationale. So the 2013 item is asking us to describe the research question and justification for undertaking the trial, including a summary of relevant studies, examining the benefits and harms for each intervention. But the extension item for PROs goes further than this and asks us to focus and describe the PRO's specific research question and the rationale for assessment, and summarise PRO findings in relevant studies. And this is really important because in a review of studies on a UK portfolio that my team and indeed Professor King's team reviewed a few years ago, we found that actually only 8% of these trials had a clear rationale for assessment. More recently, a paper that we've published in JNCI has highlighted that this percentage has increased, certainly in an oncology setting, but still, nevertheless, there are a large number of trials that simply don't address this point. Why should we be addressing this point? Well, Having a clear rationale for assessment really focuses your mind when you're developing the protocol. We need to understand how these data are going to be used. What is the purpose for assessing the PRO in study? Is it for a regulatory approval? Is it to inform health technology assessment? Are you looking to assess the efficacy of the treatment through collecting the PRO? Or are you looking to assess adverse events? There are an increasing number of PROs that can then look at safety and tolerability reporting. So you need to really think clearly at the start, what is your question? What is it that you're trying to address? And how are these data going to be used? And that will really focus the mind for the later extension items. Crucially, this will also help, as I mentioned earlier, the staff and the patients understand why the PROs are being assessed. So it might help reduce missing data in your study. And even when the PRO is a secondary outcome, having a brief rationale is important. It could be brief, that might be adequate enough, but I would still really highly recommend having a rationale clearly specified, even in a sentence or two within your protocol. So now we move on to item 7, which is objectives, that we clearly need to specify the objectives or hypotheses as stated in Spirit 2013. And specifically, we need to specify the PRO objectives or hypotheses, including any relevant PRO concepts or domains. Pre-specifying the objectives and hypotheses encourages identification of the key PRO domains and the time points, and this will help reduce the risk of multiple statistical testing and selective reporting of results. We know that in trials, we're collecting PRO data often at multiple time points. Instruments, you can often look at the overall score or subdomain scores. So really being very clear about what your objective is, whether you're looking at overall score at a certain time point, is really crucial to avoid this issue of multiple statistical testing. So now let's move on to the next section of the protocol, the methods, and consider the issues around participants, interventions, and outcomes. Spirit item 10 is focused on eligibility criteria. And in Spirit 2013, the item recommended inclusion and exclusion criteria for participants being stated, and if applicable, eligibility criteria for study centres and individuals who will perform the interventions also being described. Now, this is a Spirit Pro extension item where we believe that you should specify any pro-specific eligibility criteria. So this might include language or reading requirements or pre-randomization completion of PROs. Now, a further point to this is that if PROs will not be collected in the entire study sample, that you should also provide a rationale and describe the method for obtaining the subsample in whom you are going to be collecting your PRO data. So what's the reason for this? Well, in some trials, sadly, it might not be possible to collect PROs in the entire population, and this may occur if you don't have, for example, questionnaires validated in the population of interest. I think this is an important problem that as trialists and as international stakeholders we need to address to make our trials as inclusive as possible. And actually thinking about this at an early stage in your trial design might allow you to undertake translations and cultural validations using appropriate methods. But however, as I recognise, sometimes this isn't possible. And if this is the case, this needs to be specified in your eligibility criteria. And the point around not collecting the PROs in the entire study sample, well, this might be the case if you have a large trial where you might have sufficient power, which will be achieved by collecting PROs for a representative subset of the population. But as we said, if that's the case, you need to really clearly specify how this subsample from the trial population will be established. Okay, so now we're going to look at Spirit item 12, focused on outcomes. Spirit 2013 stated that the primary, secondary and other outcomes, including the specific measurement variable, analysis metric, method of aggregation and time point for each outcome should be specified. Explanation of the clinical relevance of the chosen efficacy and harm outcomes is strongly recommended. Here we have a Spirit extension, which states that you should specify the pro concepts and domains used to evaluate the intervention. For example, are you interested in the overall quality of life score, a specific domain, or a specific symptom? And for each of these, you should clearly specify the analysis metric. So examples would be change from baseline, a final value, time to event, and crucially, the principal time point or period of interest. These outcomes should clearly align with the trial's objectives and hypotheses. And because we can analyse these data at numerous time points, and often you can look at the overall score or a subdomain score, it's really important that we clearly define not only the actual metric, but also the time point of interest to reduce the risk of multiple statistical testing. So now let's turn to Spirit item 13, the participant timeline. So Spirit 2013 stated that time schedule of enrolment, interventions and any run-ins and assessments and visits for participants should be stated. And they recommended that a schematic diagram is included. The Spirit Pro extension states that you should include a schedule of pro assessments and rationale for the time points, justifying if the initial assessment is not pre-randomization. Personally, I find it really helpful to discuss this with the clinical team and to draw out what you expect the PRO score to do over time, any changes that you would anticipate over time, and help use that discussion with the clinical team and patient partners to help work out what is the optimal schedule for assessments. You should also specify the time windows and whether PRO is collected prior to clinical assessments, and if using multiple questionnaires, whether the order of the administration will be standardised. Having a clear schedule of assessments will again assist staff and may help produce missing data. If you collect your PRO pre-randomisation, it will help ensure unbiased baseline assessment, and we'd recommend this in the majority of trials. And if you include this as an eligibility criteria, it might ensure data completeness. Time windows also ensure that PROs are captured the effect of the clinical events of interest. So it's really important to think about not only about the time point for assessment, but also the clinically relevant time window around that assessment, and to specify that in your protocol. So Spirit item 14 is focused on sample size. And Spirit 2013 states that the estimated number of participants needed to achieve study objectives and how it was determined, including the clinical and statistical assumptions supporting sample size calculations, should be stated. The PRO elaboration to this is that where a PRO is the primary endpoint, you should state the required sample size and how it was determined, and recruitment target accounting for any expected loss to follow-up. If the sample size is not established based on the PRO endpoint, then you should discuss the power of the principal pro analyses. Now, in terms of the explanation for this, as with all primary outcomes, that's what you would usually base your sample size for your study on. So if the PROs are the primary, you need to ideally specify the criteria for clinical significance, for example, minimally important difference if known. But even if the PROs are a secondary outcome in your study, then it's useful to specify whether the sample size that you're planning provides sufficient power to test the principal PRO hypotheses. So now let's turn to further methods, particularly focusing now on data collection, management, and analysis. So here we're going to now look at Spirit item 18A, focused on data collection methods. So the Spirit 2013 statement stated that plans for assessment and collection of outcome, baseline and other trial data, including any related processes to promote data quality, and a description of study instruments along with their reliability and validity should be specified if known, and reference to where data collection forms can be found if not in the protocol. There are 4 PRO extensions relating to this particular Spirit 2013 item, which I'm now going to describe in more detail to you. The first of these, Spirit item 18A1, just is that you should justify the PRO instrument, Describe the domains, the number of items, recall period, instrument scaling and scoring, for example, the range and direction of scores indicating a good and poor outcome. Also, evidence of the PRO instrument measurement properties, interpretation guidelines, and patient acceptability and burden should be cited if available, ideally in the population of interest. You should also state whether the measure will be used in accordance with any user manual and specify any justify any deviations if planned. Now, the selection of PRO questionnaires requires really careful consideration. There are hundreds of measures that are now available for you to choose from. So looking carefully at the psychometric properties, but also thinking about patient acceptability and burden is really crucial in selecting the right questionnaire for your study. And questionnaires should be used in accordance with any existing user manuals to make sure that the data quality and standardized scoring is met. So if you do plan to deviate, you really should specify this within your study protocol. So we now turn to the second item relating to Spirit 18A. This is another PRO extension, which is focused on including a data collection plan outlining the permitted modes of administration, for example, paper, telephone, electronic or other, and the setting, whether it's in the clinic, the participant's own home, a combination or other. The reason for this is it's really important that the research personnel and also the trial participants know how, when and where the PRO data are going to be collected. So for the trial participant, this information should also be included in the participant information sheet. And the setting for the PRO data collection should be described and standardized across trial intervention groups and sites. Now, it may be that you need to consider using multiple modes of administration, for example, electronic modes, but possibly with a backup of paper-based or telephone interview options. And again, this should be clearly specified in the protocol. It's also useful to detail what will happen if participants don't have access to electronic devices, whether they will be provisioned with devices during the trial. Now, if electronic PRO measures contain any minor modifications with respect to paper-based versions, usability testing and cognitive debriefing may provide sufficient evidence of equivalence within your study. And again, it's good practice to detail all of these aspects within this particular extension item within your protocol. The third Spirit 18A extension is to specify whether more than one language version will be used and state whether translated versions have been developed using currently recommended methods. As I mentioned earlier, in regards to the eligibility criteria, trials involving participants with different languages require measures that have been translated and culturally adapted where needed using appropriate methodology. Over my years working in PRO research, a number of colleagues have over time said to me, "Oh, I speak a particular language and I'm very happy to just quickly translate this questionnaire for you." But it's really important to note that that is not an accepted approach, that actually you need to follow a very precise methodology. And there's an excellent ISOQOL Taskforce paper which describes this, where you undertake forward and backward translations and cultural validity work. So thinking about this early in your trial design, perhaps trying to capture information around what languages are going to be needed for your trial and thinking about costing this into your grant if possible, or doing translation work using it either yourselves following the guidance or using a provider experienced in doing this is really important to try and promote the inclusion of participants from diverse backgrounds in trials, and also ensure that your results are generalizable to the population of interest. So we now turn to Spirit item 18A, the fourth item in this series. When the trial context requires someone other than the trial participant to answer on their behalf, you need to state and justify this. And this is what we would call a proxy reported outcome. And you need to provide and cite evidence of the validity of the proxy assessment if it's available. And I think it's important to note that this might not always be available, but if it is, you should cite it. So why might we need to undertake proxy assessment? Well, in some contexts, for example, trials involving young children or cognitively impaired participants, or potentially in palliative care trials, it may be necessary for someone other than the trial participant to respond on that participant's behalf. What you need to do is clearly justify and specify the proxy reporting in the protocol, and this will allow external reviewers to assess potential bias and will also facilitate trial reporting in accordance with Consort Pro. You might also want to consider a period where both the proxy and the participant are completing the measure at the same time to help assess the levels of potential bias that may be incurred. So I'm now going to hand back over to Professor King to take us through the remaining items. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Calvert. I'll pick up with item 18B of Spirit. And as you see in the 2013 statement, this item reads, plans to promote participant retention and complete follow-up. And it includes a list of any outcome data to be collected for participants who discontinue or deviate from the intervention protocols, that is, the treatments that they're allocated to. So with regard to PRO-specific content, there is one extension and one elaboration. The PRO-specific extension reads as follows. Specify PRO data collection and management strategies for minimizing avoidable missing data. Now, missing data are particularly problematic for PROs for a few reasons. First, PRO data cannot be obtained retrospectively after the time frame of interest or from medical records. Second, missing data reduce the effective sample size and hence power for the PRO analyses. And third, and perhaps most importantly, they are a potential source of bias because it's the patients with the poorest outcomes that are often those who do not complete the planned PRO assessments. Now, this raises my next point, which is that not all missing PRO data are avoidable. Patients, of course, have the right to decide not to complete questionnaires, and this often happens if they're feeling too unwell, or in fact, obviously a deceased patient cannot complete. But there are avoidable reasons. So some examples include staff or patient oversight and technical errors and failure. But there are some other avoidable reasons, and these include lack of explanation of the importance of the PRO data. You see, if patients and staff understand how important PRO data are, then they will likely be more inclined to complete them. Another possible reason is that the questionnaires are too long and overly burdensome for patients. So you see, there are many avoidable reasons, and this is why you need to have a plan about your strategies for minimizing these types of missing data. A very important part of such a plan is to collect the reasons why any assessments are missed, and then to review those reasons during the trial's conduct by site. The reason I say by site, if I'm assuming you're doing a multi-site trial, is that there may be some, this may raise problems at particular sites. If you see high non-completion rates at certain sites, then that gives you the opportunity to talk to the site staff, find out what's happening there, and see if there are some problems that can actually be rectified, perhaps with some staff training. So this is an absolutely key strategy. And as I say, you use this data during trial conduct to try and intervene and to minimize the avoidable missing data in that way. And then once you've got those reasons and rates of missing data, they're incredibly valuable during analysis and during write-up. So if you'd like more details about the use of missing data reasons and rates in analysis and write-up, then take a look at the Proteus webinar on analysis of PRO data and reporting of PRO data. But the takeaway message now is to include that plan in your protocol. And on the last slide of this presentation, I'll give you the citation details for an important paper that provides a range of strategies to help minimise and address missing PRO data, from study design through implementation to reporting your study results. So the second elaboration on Spirit item 18B is around the process of PRO assessment for participants who discontinue or deviate from their assigned intervention protocol. Now, it's a bit complicated here because we're using the word protocol here to mean just that little section of the trial protocol that talks about what is the treatment protocol. So we're talking specifically about when a patient is assigned to an intervention, what are the particular things, what are the doses, when are the doses to be had, and so forth. So the reason why this is really important for PROs is that sometimes I'll give you an example from cancer, which is what I'm familiar with. So a patient, often the treatments that we give patients are quite toxic. And certain patients may have quite an extreme toxic reaction, and it's no longer safe to keep them on the treatment. So we would perhaps reduce the dose, which would be to deviate from their assigned intervention, or we would discontinue completely. Now, once we've discontinued the trial intervention, then the patient may be put onto, it would be unethical not to give the patient some treatment which is off-trial treatment. If you continue to complete PROs at that stage, you're going to really muddy the waters in terms of a comparison of the two treatment arms. So it's really, really important to address this. This is one of the items that is very often not addressed and thought about in trial development. So it's an important one to note. And by having a plan and ensuring it's in the protocol, that means that staff at all different sites will collect all the required PRO data in a standardised and timely way, and they will stop collecting PRO data at the point at which that patient can no longer contribute data that is relevant to assessing the trial's PRO objectives. As the example I've given you illustrates, this also helps to minimise bias. And given that participants discontinuing or deviating from their treatment protocol is clearly of great interest to the patient themselves, then being clear on this point will help ethics committees appraise this aspect of the study. Moving now on to Spirit item 20A, which is about statistical methods. And this one, the Spirit 2013 statement talks about being required to specify your statistical methods for analysing your primary and secondary outcomes. And it may not be appropriate to put all of this detail in the protocol. In fact, it may quite often be, determining the full statistical methods is quite a lengthy process, and often protocol developers are keen to get ethics approval and get the trial moving without waiting for the statistician to develop this the full statistical analysis plan. But that's fine, but you just need to at least give some sort of summary in the protocol and refer to where other details can be found. Typically, this will be in the statistical analysis plan. So the PRO elaboration states that the PRO analysis methods need to be included, and it highlights in particular the need to address multiplicity or type 1 or alpha error. Now, this multiplicity arises because PRO questionnaires often include several different domains and scores. In addition to that, we typically assess at multiple time points. So this leads to a very complex set of analyses and hypotheses, and that's why we talk about multiple hypothesis testing, or just for short, multiplicity. And this multiplicity, in turn, inflates the probability of false positive results, or a type 1 error, or an alpha error. Now, as we've noted in item 12, pre-specifying the key PRO domains and time points actually helps with this. So you can see how this checklist actually helps in thinking and planning and putting all of your ducks in a row. So as I've said, if the protocol doesn't fully address this, then refer to details where this information can be found. Now, a second angle on statistical methods arises with Spirit item 20C. This one is about, in the Spirit 2013, the general issue is around analysis relating to protocol non-adherence and methods for handling missing data. So there are some very special considerations for PROs. And so the elaboration says, state how missing data will be described and outline the methods for handling missing data or missing items or entire assessments. Now, there's those two parts refer to the two levels of missing data. First of all, you can have some items or questions in a questionnaire that are missed. Now, how those are dealt with are usually specified in the instrument scoring algorithm. Commonly, they're imputed based on the number of items completed, as long as at least half of the items in the scale have been completed. However, you really need to go to the instrument scoring algorithm for this. The second type of missing data is actually much more important. That's where an entire PRO assessment has been missed. And I referred to this earlier. It's quite often the case that this type of missing data comes from patients who are sicker. So the statistical analysis that you use will come with assumptions about this missing data, the missingness mechanism. And you need to ensure that the missing data mechanism that you observe in your data is actually consistent with the assumptions of your statistical analysis and modelling. This gets back to the point of describing your missing data. So what are the patterns of missing data? There's quite a lot in that. And again, it's another very big topic, but you can read more about it in the Spirit PRO Elaboration and Explanation paper. And I'll highlight that on the last slide. So now we come to another Spirit section, which is still in the methods, but this is monitoring. And the Spirit 2013 item talks about planning, needing to plan and to specify your plans for collecting, assessing, reporting and managing adverse events and other unintended effects of trial interventions or trial conduct. Now, PROs have a very special aspect when it comes to this, because patients are actually reporting on, in many cases, their symptoms such as pain, and also psychological aspects such as anxiety. And it may be the case that those data will be monitored during the study to inform the clinical care of trial participants. Now, admittedly, this has not really happened much in the past, but I think moving forward, this is something that might be done more and more. This is an item that is very rarely addressed in clinical trials protocols historically. But again, there is going to be increasing expectation that from ethical review committees that it should be addressed explicitly. So, of course, you don't. This doesn't mandate that you must monitor the PROs to inform the clinical care of the trial participants, but it does mandate that you need to say whether or not you are doing that. And if you are, then how any worrying PRO data will be managed in a standardized way. Also, obviously, this needs to be described to potential trial participants, so should be, for example, in the participant information sheet and consent form. Now, just by way of explanation, the monitoring of PRO data in a trial may be there to protect participants' safety. Things such as psychological distress or physical symptoms that are at worrying levels may require an immediate response. Now, these are called PRO alerts. And it follows that, like everything else in our trial, we need to minimize, we need to standardize that in order to minimize potential bias. Now, this is something that I've done some qualitative work with trial coordinators, and also there's other work from my team members and others that has been published about this. This is something, because it's not addressed often in clinical trials, it is a source of some concern and to trial coordinators, because they don't know what they should be doing. That then leads to variation in what's done, which is definitely not what you want in a clinical trial. The final point here is that even if you're not going to be monitoring this data, you could provide alternative support mechanisms for patients, such as, a helpline for psychological distress. Okay, well, that finishes the Spirit Pro items. So let's now think about the implications of using this guidance. And you can see here that we have multiple benefits across different user groups. Understanding and following the checklist will encourage and assist protocol writers to plan the PRO components of their trials, and that in turn will improve the PRO trial design. Thinking about protocol reviewers, such as ethics committee members and patient partners, this will help them to understand and assess the PRO elements. When it comes to the trial staff and participants, having all of the relevant information in a protocol helps them understand the rationale for the PRO assessment. And once they understand that, that might actually encourage completion of questionnaires in a timely fashion, which will improve the data, PRO data completeness. And being clear on the standardized procedures for all aspects of the PRO methodology should improve the PRO data quality. So all of this in turn facilitates high quality analysis and reporting, and ultimately improves the quality of the PRO evidence base. So just to recap, the Spirit Pro checklist is needed because the PRO contents of protocols is often incomplete and inconsistent. We know that from evidence and systematic reviews that we've done, and you can read about these in the suggested readings. Spirit Pro is designed to be used as a supplement to the general Spirit 2013 guidelines, as Professor Calvert and I have emphasised throughout this presentation. The Spirit Pro guidance recommends 16 PRO-specific items that should be included, and these are a minimum standard. These are the absolutes that need to be included for all randomized controlled trials that include PROs as either a primary or even a secondary outcome. So please keep this in mind, because it's most common that they are secondary outcomes, but this all is relevant to them. It's all about standardizing the key procedures and information. So if we use this checklist, that'll ensure that critical aspects of the PROs are included in the protocol. And this is the first and critical step towards producing high quality PRO data and evidence. But it's one thing to have a checklist, and it's another thing to use it. So implementation is absolutely the key. So I really hope that you're able to put into practice what you've learned from this presentation. And by following the Spirit Pro recommendations, we can improve the quality and completeness of PRO contents in protocols. Here's the further reading that I mentioned earlier on. The first paper is the Spirit Pro Explanation and Elaboration paper that I've referred to. It provides further information to promote your understanding and facilitate uptake of the recommended items. For each item, we provide detailed description, one or more examples from existing trial protocols, and other supporting empirical evidence about the item's importance. This paper also includes a protocol template that covers all the Spirit Pro extension checklist items. So that might be a really useful resource for you as well. As Mel and I have emphasised, we recommend that you use this paper and the other Spirit Pro paper that we've introduced earlier alongside the Spirit 2013 statement. And so the second and third references here will guide you to what that statement is if you're not familiar with it. And even if you are familiar with it, it always helps to have a checklist. It just makes protocol development so much more efficient. The fourth paper is a companion paper to the first, and it provides tools to support the involvement of patient partners in the development of clinical trial protocols. And I know this is a topic that Professor Calvert is very passionate about, and I think is going to be of increasing interest and importance moving forward as patient partners become more involved in trials. The fifth paper provides greater detail on patient-reported outcome alerts, and the sixth paper provides a comprehensive set of strategies to reduce the instance and impact of missing PRO data. This is a systematic review that I referred to earlier when I was saying missing data is a huge topic, but there's a lot that you can do about it, as it says in the design, implementation and reporting, right across the trial's life cycle. The final suggestion there is the FDA guidance, which provides an authoritative coverage of many of the principles needed for high quality PRO research. So we hope you've found this presentation interesting and informative, and we wish you well in your future research efforts. Thank you so much for your time and attention.